Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty stands on the bridge of HMS Campbeltown at 20 past midnight on 28th March 1942, gripping the wooden rail with both hands as the Loire estuary narrows around him. Ahead, the water glows faintly under a thin moon, and the silhouette of St Nazaire rises from the darkness, a tangle of cranes, warehouses, and gun emplacements crouched along the French coast. The ship beneath his feet is doing 19 knots, her four funnels cut down and angled to resemble a German Mu-class destroyer. A swastika ensign fluttering from her mast as a final piece of deception. Beatty can smell diesel and salt air, and beneath it, faintly, cordite from the guns already opening up along the shore. In the bow, hidden behind steel plating and concrete casing, 24 depth charges, packed with amatol explosive, sit wired and waiting, nearly 5 tons in total, time to detonate long after the ship has done what she came to do. Beatty has one job left. He must ram this obsolete destroyer directly into the caisson gates of the Normandie dry dock, at speed, and he has less than 15 minutes to do it. What Beatty is steering towards is not simply a dock, it is the largest dry dock in the world, completed a decade earlier in 1932 to service the great transatlantic liner Normandie, and by March 1942, it is the only dry dock on the entire Atlantic coast of occupied Europe capable of holding a ship the size of the German battleship Tirpitz. That single fact has occupied British naval planners for months. Tirpitz, sister ship to the sunk Bismarck, sits in Norwegian waters, and Admiralty planners in London know that if she ever breaks out into the Atlantic and suffers damage, St Nazaire is the only place on the entire coastline able to repair her. Deny the Germans that dock, and Tirpitz becomes a liability rather than a threat, forced to either stay bottled up in Norway or risk the long and dangerous return voyage past British home waters for repairs. Winston Churchill has been briefed on the plan personally. Lord Louis Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations, has pushed it through against considerable scepticism from within the Admiralty, who regard the whole scheme as close to suicidal. The plan itself, codenamed Operation Chariot, has been assembled over several weeks by Combined Operations Headquarters. HMS Campbeltown, formerly the American destroyer USS Buchanan, built during the First World War and handed to Britain in 1940 as part of the Destroyers for Bases agreement with the United States, has been stripped of much of her original equipment to lighten her draft, fitted with extra armour plating along her sides, and disguised to pass at a distance and in darkness for a German vessel. She sails from Falmouth on 26 March, accompanied by 2 escort destroyers, HMS Atherstone and HMS Tyndale, and 18 smaller craft, 16 wooden-hulled motor launches, 1 motor gunboat, and 1 motor torpedo boat. Aboard the flotilla travel 265 commandos of No. 2 Commando and various specialist demolition parties, alongside 346 Royal Navy officers, and ratings 611 men in total, crossing open water for 2 days before turning towards the mouth of the Loire on the night of the raid. Getting Campbeltown into position has required weeks of preparation most of the men aboard her know nothing about. At Devonport Dockyard, engineers spent late February and early March cutting down her 4 original funnels to 2, angling them to mimic the silhouette of a German Mu-class torpedo boat destroyer, while welders bolted additional armour plating along both flanks to protect against the machine gun fire everyone expects on the run-in. The 24 depth charges packed into her bow were cemented together into a single mass and encased in concrete and steel, a design intended to survive both the ramming impact and any German attempt to defuse or remove the charges before they detonate. Commandos assigned to the demolition parties trained for weeks on a full-scale replica of the St Nazaire dock installations, built in secrecy on the English coast, memorising the layout of pumping houses, winding gear, and lock gates until each team can locate its target in complete darkness. Motor launch crews, many of them barely out of their teens, rehearse the approach up the Loire estuary, using charts and aerial photographs supplied by RAF reconnaissance flights over the preceding month, studying sandbanks and shoal water that could ground the flotilla long before it reaches the target. By 11:30 on the night of the 28th, the deception is already fraying. 5 squadrons of RAF bombers have begun a diversionary raid over St Nazaire, intended to draw German attention skyward and mask the sound of the approaching flotilla. But thick cloud sits over the target, and Combined Operations Headquarters has explicitly ordered the bombers not to drop through blind cloud cover for fear of killing French civilians in the town below. The result is a strange, thin raid, a handful of aircraft circling without releasing their bombs. And this oddity is precisely what alerts the German garrison commander, Kapitän zur See Karl Konrad Mecker, that something unusual is happening. Mecker orders his gun crews to remain at their positions rather than stand down after the air raid warning passes. Searchlights snap on along the shoreline at 1:20 in the morning. A dozen beams begin sweeping the water. Campbeltown, flying her false ensign, transmits a German recognition signal by lamp, buying herself perhaps 4 or 5 critical minutes of confusion before the deception collapses entirely and German gun crews open fire along the length of the estuary. What follows happens with brutal speed. Tracer fire crisscrosses the water. 2 of Campbeltown's helmsmen are hit at the wheel, 1 killed outright, 1 wounded, and Beatty himself effectively steers the final approach through the chaos on the bridge. At 1:34, 4 minutes behind the original schedule, HMS Campbeltown strikes the southern caisson gate of the Normandie Dock at 19 knots, her reinforced bow driving 33 feet up onto the structure itself, the impact throwing men off their feet along the length of the ship. Around her, the smaller craft are faring far worse. German coastal batteries, now fully alert, rake the wooden motor launches with cannon and machine gun fire at near point-blank range. Of the 16 launches that entered the estuary, most are hit. Several burst into flame almost immediately, their fuel tanks igniting, and men who survived the initial fire go into the water in the cold March night wearing battle dress and boots. For the ordinary residents of St Nazaire, woken by gunfire and the drone of aircraft overhead, the night unfolds as a bewildering intrusion into lives already reshaped by 2 years of German occupation. Curfew has confined French civilians to their homes since well before dark, and families in flats overlooking the docks watch tracer fire arc across the water from behind blacked-out windows, unable to tell British raider from German defender in the confusion. Some later recall counting the flashes of gunfire from cellars where they had already taken shelter against the earlier RAF bombing, uncertain whether the town itself is now the target. A handful of dock workers and fishermen, moving early to their boats or workshops in the hours before dawn, find themselves the first civilian witnesses to burning motor launches drifting on the tide, and British sailors wading ashore soaked and disoriented, several of whom are quietly given dry clothes or pointed towards hiding places before German patrols reach the same streets. Ashore, the commando parties who have scrambled off Campbeltown's deck move fast, working from a plan rehearsed for weeks in Britain on a full-scale mock-up of the dock installations. Demolition teams under specific orders head directly for the pumping house that drains and fills the dock, for the winding houses that operate the caisson gates, and for the lock gates connecting the dock to the submarine basin further along the port. Sergeant Thomas Durrant, manning an exposed Lewis machine gun position aboard one of the motor launches, continues firing on a German destroyer at close range even after being hit multiple times, an action so conspicuous that the German officer who eventually captures his position will later recommend him for a decoration. Durrant dies of his wounds and is posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the only commando ever to receive the award for an action fought entirely at sea. Within 20 minutes of Campbeltown striking the gates, the demolition teams have destroyed the pumping machinery and the winding gear controlling both sets of caisson doors, achieving the raid's core technical objective before German reinforcements can organise an effective counterattack through the dock complex. What the commandos cannot achieve is their own evacuation. The plan called for the motor launches to land the raiding parties, then withdraw them back down the Loire under covering fire once demolition work was complete. Instead, by 1:30 in the morning, most of the launches are burning wrecks or have already been sunk in the estuary, their crews dead, wounded, or swimming for the riverbank. Lieutenant Colonel Augustus Newman, in overall command of the military force ashore, realises within the hour that seaborne evacuation is no longer possible for the bulk of his men. He gives the order that the survivors are to fight their way out through the town of St Nazaire, itself an attempt to reach neutral Spain overland, more than 600 kilometres to the south. Small groups break into the streets around the docks, exchanging fire with German patrols in narrow lanes between warehouses, several commandos surviving on nothing but chocolate and biscuits carried in their battle dress pockets as they attempt to slip past checkpoints in the hours before dawn. If this deep dive into one of the war's most audacious raids is holding your attention, a quick subscribe helps more than you might think, and costs nothing at all. Dawn on 28th March finds the port of St Nazaire in a state its German garrison has never previously experienced. Bodies lie along the dockside and in the wrecked hulls of motor launches still smouldering in the estuary. German medical staff move among British wounded, some of whom will later describe surprisingly correct treatment from their captors, a formality that will not extend to everyone involved in the raid. Of the 611 men who set out from Falmouth, 169 are killed in the raid itself, 215 are taken prisoner in the days that follow, most captured attempting the overland escape through the surrounding French countryside, and only 228 men make it back to Britain. A handful by sea in the few launches that survive, the rest through remarkable individual escapes across occupied France and into Spain over the following weeks and months, aided in several cases by French civilians and resistance contacts, who hide them in barns, cellars and backrooms, despite the obvious risk of German reprisal. German occupying forces respond to the raid with a mixture of confusion and escalating suspicion of the local population. Patrols move through the streets of St Nazaire and the surrounding countryside for days afterward, stopping and questioning anyone found away from their registered address, aware that surviving commandos are attempting to move through the region on foot towards Spain. Checkpoints appear on roads leading south and east from the town, and several French farmers and shopkeepers who provide food, clothing or brief shelter to escaping British soldiers do so knowing that discovery could mean deportation, or worse, under the occupation's reprisal policies. The garrison commander Capitaine Zursi Mecca orders an immediate review of coastal defences along the Loire estuary, concerned that the raid exposed weaknesses in a defensive system he had regarded as more than adequate against seaborne attack, a review that will influence how German commanders assess the vulnerability of other Atlantic ports in the months that follow. For the German garrison and naval command at St Nazaire, the morning brings a false sense that the crisis has passed. HMS Campbeltown sits wedged into the dock gates exactly as she rammed them the night before, and German officers, engineers, and curious personnel climb aboard through the day to inspect the vessel, gather souvenirs, and assess what damage has been done. Some accounts describe organised tours of the wreck. What none of them know is that the 24 depth charges buried in her bow are fitted with delayed action fuses, set to detonate between 8 and 10 hours after activation, a mechanism the raiders triggered before abandoning ship the previous night. At 10:30 that morning, with an unknown but substantial number of German officers and men aboard or near the ship, Campbeltown explodes. The blast obliterates the ship, destroys the case and gate she had already wrecked by collision, and kills, by most later estimates, more than 200 German personnel in a single detonation, a toll that eclipses even the raid's own combat casualties from the night before. The physical result is unambiguous. The Normandie Dock, the largest dry dock in the world, and the only facility on the entire Atlantic coast capable of servicing the battleship Tirpitz, is rendered completely inoperable. French and German engineers begin assessment work within days, but the scale of destruction to the caisson gates, the pumping systems, and the winding machinery is such that full repair proves impossible under wartime conditions. The dock does not return to full operational service until 1947, 5 years after the raid, well beyond the end of the war itself. For the entire remaining conflict, the German Navy possesses no facility on the Atlantic seaboard able to repair a capital ship of Tirpitz's size, and the battleship spends the rest of the war confined largely to Norwegian fjords, watched constantly by British reconnaissance, and eventually sunk at anchor in November 1944 by RAF Lancaster bombers using tallboy bombs, having never once ventured into the open Atlantic to threaten Allied convoys in the way the Admiralty had feared in early 1942. The cost of achieving that result becomes clear only gradually, as prisoner lists filter back through Red Cross channels, and survivors are debriefed by naval intelligence over the following months. German casualties from the raid and subsequent explosion exceed 360 dead, a figure that startles even senior British planners given the scale of the raiding force involved. On the British side, the human cost sits alongside an unusual concentration of gallantry awards. 5 Victoria Crosses are eventually granted for actions during Operation Chariot, more than for any other single operation of the Second World War, awarded to men including Lieutenant Commander Beatty for the ramming itself, Lieutenant Colonel Newman for his command of the shore party, and Sergeant Durrant for his machine gun action, alongside 2 further recipients recognised for conduct during the desperate withdrawal along the Loire. The disproportion between the size of the force, just over 600 men, and the number of Victoria Crosses awarded becomes, in the years that follow, a shorthand within the Royal Navy and Commando establishment for the sheer intensity of what happened in those few hours. Word of the raid's success reaches London within days, filtered through partial and sometimes contradictory reports, and Combined Operations Headquarters under Mountbatten treats it as vindication of a strategy that many in the Admiralty had opposed as reckless in the planning stages. The raid becomes public knowledge in Britain within weeks, reported in newspapers as evidence that offensive action against occupied Europe remains possible even at a stage of the war when direct invasion is still years away, a morale consideration that matters as much to planners in 1942 as the tactical result at St Nazaire itself. Survivors who make it home through Spain, several after journeys lasting months and covering hundreds of kilometres on foot, by train, and hidden in the backs of lorries arranged by resistance networks, are debriefed extensively, their accounts helping to refine tactics for later, larger raids against the French coast still to come. The tactical lessons drawn from Operation Chariot ripple forward through the rest of the war in ways the men involved could not have anticipated on the night itself. Planners studying the raid's outcome note the effectiveness of a single heavily laden vessel, used as a delivery mechanism for demolition charges, an approach that shapes later thinking about how to neutralise fixed enemy installations without committing large invasion forces. The near-total loss of the motor launch flotilla, seen in hindsight as the raid's greatest failure, drives changes in the design and tactical use of small craft in subsequent combined operations raids later in 1942, including the much larger and ultimately disastrous assault on Dieppe that August, where lessons about coastal defences, timing, and withdrawal planning drawn partly from St Nazaire inform but do not entirely prevent further heavy losses. Within the commando establishment itself, Chariot becomes a formative case study, taught to new recruits as an example of what a small, disciplined force can achieve against a fixed target when planning, rehearsal and timing align, even when the operation's cost in lives runs far higher than its planners had hoped. Stephen Beatty is not among the men who reach Spain. He is captured on the dockside within hours of the ramming, taken prisoner alongside dozens of others, and spends the remainder of the war in German captivity, receiving news of his Victoria Cross only after the fact, delivered through official channels, while he sits in a prisoner of war camp far from the estuary where he earned it. He will not see the wreck of Campbeltown again, will not walk the dockside at St Nazaire in daylight, will not know until his eventual repatriation in 1945 that the dock he rammed his ship into on a dark March night remained unusable for 5 years beyond the war's end. What he does know, standing on that bridge at 20 past midnight, guiding an obsolete destroyer at 19 knots towards a set of steel gates in a hostile harbour, is only that the ship must strike true, that the timing must hold, and that everything else, the fate of Tirpitz, the 5-year closure of the world's largest dry dock, the 5 Victoria Crosses, the men who will not come home, lies beyond the reach of what any single man on that bridge can see in the dark.